Oliver Grant sat by the window, his pencil tapping in a soft, steady rhythm against the edge of his worn-out notebook. It wasn't nerves. It was never nerves. Just a habit. His mom always told him to stop. It could drive people crazy, but it helped him think. The classroom of Monroe Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with the usual morning energy. Students whispered and laughed, trading rumors, notes, and last-minute homework answers before first period began. Oliver ignored it all, his eyes fixed on the half-finished worksheet in front of him. He liked to get things done early, less to worry about later. At the front of the room, Miss Caroline Ellsworth leafed through her lesson plan with methodical precision. She had been teaching sixth grade for over 15 years, and in that time, she'd built a reputation as strict but fair. At least, that's how people described her, those lucky enough to be in her favor. Oliver wasn't one of them. He never had been. It was never obvious. She didn't raise her voice at him. She didn't insult him. But he noticed the way she avoided calling on him, even when his hand shot up first. If he gave the right answer, which he almost always did, she'd move on like it hadn't mattered. If he slipped up, which was rare, she lingered on it, letting it hang there in the air, quiet but heavy. He noticed. A few classmates did, too. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," whispered Diego Martinez, the boy who sat next to him most days. Diego was the kind of kid who said things others only thought. You got like teacher invisibility or something. Oliver had only shrugged. Guess he do. But today felt different. Miss Ellsworth's eyes kept flicking his way, more times in the first few minutes than they usually did all week. Not angry, not suspicious, expectant. He didn't like it. The lesson began, as always, a chapter on the Civil War. Oliver scribbled down notes, careful and neat, waiting for the pattern to repeat itself. She'd ask Diego, or Madison Lou, or maybe even Connor Phelps. She'd glide past him without missing a beat. But then, "Oliver," Miss Ellsworth said crisply, "why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Diego nearly dropped his pencil. Oliver blinked. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. She never called on him. Ever. He sat up straighter, eyes scanning the question on the whiteboard. General Sherman's March to the Sea, he said after a pause, was a military campaign designed to cripple the Confederacy by destroying its resources and morale. Miss Ellsworth pursed her lips. Not bad. She made a small note in her binder, her face unreadable. Some of the other students exchanged glances. Diego gave Oliver a nudge like, "What was that about?" The lesson went on, but something had shifted. Miss Ellsworth was watching him now. Not just keeping tabs, but really watching. And then, right before the bell, she made her move. "Oliver," she said as students packed up their things. "Stay behind for a moment." A few kids slowed down, curiosity holding them back. Oliver took his time, stuffing his books into his bag. Then he made his way to her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, folding her hands together neatly. "About your grandfather." Oliver frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." There was something heavy in her tone. Not interest, not kindness. He nodded anyway. "Yeah, he played jazz piano." Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. "Interesting." She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping her desk like she was counting out a rhythm. "I suppose you picked up a thing or two." Oliver hesitated. This wasn't curiosity. It was a test. "A little," he said cautiously. Her grin widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Good to know." The bell rang. Oliver grabbed his bag and turned to leave, but her voice cut through the shuffle of feet. "Tomorrow," she said, gesturing toward the old, upright piano in the corner of the classroom. "Let's see what you've got." He turned back slowly. "You want me to play?" She nodded once. "Something simple will do." There was nothing casual about it, nothing encouraging. Oliver knew exactly what this was. She expected him to fumble. She wanted it. He could see it in her eyes. He nodded anyway. "Okay." Oliver barely slept that night. He stared at the ceiling in the quiet darkness, hands folded on his chest, heart pounding with the same rhythm his pencil had tapped that morning. He knew what tomorrow was. Not an invitation. A challenge. The kind where losing meant losing big. But she didn't know everything. The next morning, word had traveled. Monroe Middle wasn't huge. Whispers swirled around him as he took his seat. Diego leaned in, voice low. "You're really going to play?" Oliver kept his eyes on his notebook. "Guess I am." Brandon Keene, a kid who laughed too loud and too often, smirked from across the room. "Didn't know you were a piano player, Grant." Oliver said nothing. There was nothing to say. Miss Ellsworth entered, her steps sharp against the tile. She set her books down with a practiced ease. She didn't even look at him, at least not directly, but Oliver could feel the anticipation curling in the space between them. The first half of class crawled by. Oliver took notes, but his mind wasn't on history. It was on the piano, sitting like a dare in the corner. Then came her signal. "Well," Miss Ellsworth said, closing her textbook. "We have a little time." "Perfect." She turned toward him. "Oliver, let's see what you can do." The room stilled. Chairs creaked as students shifted to get a better view. Oliver stood slowly, ignoring the whispers that trailed him to the piano. Miss Ellsworth folded her hands. "Play whatever you like." The upright was old. Keys yellowed at the edges, some chipped. He ran his fingers lightly across them. Out of tune. Not by much, but enough. He inhaled, sat down, placed his hands on the keys. Someone laughed, low and sharp. Another snickered. It didn't matter. The first notes were soft, cautious only in their volume, not their clarity. A slow blues progression. His grandfather's favorite. His hands found the rhythm as though it had never left him. Left hand steady, right hand weaving melodies that floated above the beat. The room was quiet, dead quiet. Even the kids who had chuckled before were still. Miss Ellsworth's arms remained crossed, but her brow furrowed. She had expected something else. Oliver didn't look up. He didn't need to. He wasn't playing for them anymore. Not her. Not his classmates. He was playing for himself. For his grandfather. His fingers danced over the keys, building momentum, adding flourishes. He shifted into something harder, a run his grandfather had taught him, the one that took him months to master. A bass line thumped beneath soaring notes that pulled and twisted through minor scales before resolving. The silence around him grew heavier. Tyler's mouth hung open slightly. Brandon had stopped leaning back and now sat forward, arms crossed tight. And then the crescendo. Oliver drove his fingers into the keys, letting the chords fill every crack in the room. The final note rang out, hanging there before fading. He let his hands fall to his lap. No one moved. Then one clap. Another. Then a burst of applause. Tyler let out a low whistle. Brandon shook his head. "I didn't know he could do that." Oliver's chest heaved, not from exhaustion, but from release. Miss Ellsworth didn't clap. She didn't move. Her lips were pressed thin, eyes fixed on him. "Well," she said at last. That was unexpected. The clapping faltered. Heads turned toward her. The tension in the room snapped back into place. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" she asked, voice flat. "My grandfather," Oliver answered. Something flickered in her face. "Gone too fast to catch." "I see," she said. Then, like the whole thing was an afterthought, she turned to the class. "Let's move on." Nobody moved. Tyler stared at Oliver. Madison glared at Miss Ellsworth, arms crossed. Brandon broke the silence. "That's it." Miss Ellsworth's eyes snapped toward him. "Excuse me." Brandon shrugged. "He plays like someone off TV. And you're just going to move on?" Several heads nodded. Whispers rippled. "This is a classroom," Miss Ellsworth said tightly. "Not a talent show." Oliver sat still. "Come. You didn't think I could play," he said evenly. Her gaze sharpened. "I gave you an opportunity." "No," Oliver said. "You gave me a chance to fail." Whispers grew louder. "That's enough," she said, her voice rising. "You wouldn't have asked Diego," he continued. "Or Madison. Or Brandon. You asked me." Her hands tightened on the desk. "Sit down." For the first time that year, Oliver didn't immediately obey. He looked at the faces around him, kids who hadn't seen him before. Now they did. Slowly, he returned to his seat. The room didn't go back to normal. Miss Ellsworth's control had cracked. She pushed through the rest of the lesson, but the students weren't paying attention like before. And when the bell rang, and they packed their things, The murmurs hadn't stopped. As Oliver reached the door, she called his name. He turned back. "I hope you understand," she said quietly. "This is still my classroom." Oliver studied her, then said, "Calm and sure, I know." And he walked out. Diego caught up with him outside. "Bro, what was that?" Oliver let out a breath. "I played." Diego grinned. "You flipped everything upside down." Oliver smiled faintly. "Maybe. You're going to play again, right?" He thought about it. About the weight lifting from his chest. About the music. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." That afternoon, he walked home lighter than he had in months. The sun cast long shadows on West Markham Street as he made his way to the little house with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. At Mr. Rowe's corner store, he bought a bottle of water. "Mr. Rowe looked at him like he knew. "You look like you did something important," the old man said. Oliver smiled. "Maybe I did." When he walked through his front door, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread met him. His mom flipped fish in the skillet, humming. "You're late," she said. "Had a long day?" Oliver answered, dropping his bag. "Good or bad?" He thought about it. About the room going silent. About the applause. About Miss Ellsworth. "Good," he said. "Really good." She sat across from him and listened as he told her everything. When he was done, she said, "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." "I think I did." "And how do you feel about that?" He smiled, like it was supposed to happen. She squeezed his hand. "Good." The next day at school, things weren't exactly the same. But they weren't the same either. At lunch, Madison sat across from him. "You're insane on the piano," she said. "How long you been playing?" "Since I was 5. Oliver replied. Diego shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out." Oliver smiled. "Guess I have." From across the cafeteria, Miss Ellsworth passed by. Their eyes met. She looked away first. Some lessons you don't find in books. Some moments change everything. Miss Ellsworth had spent the year looking past him. But not anymore. And she never saw it coming. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the best way to speak is to let your talent do the talking. And they'll have no choice but to listen.